Section 13 of A Body of Practical Divinity by Thomas Watson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Of God's power. The next attribute is God's power. Job 9 verse 19, If I speak of strength, lo, he is strong. In this chapter is a magnificent description of God's power. Lo, he is strong. The Hebrew word for strong signifies a conquering, prevailing strength. He is strong. The superlative degree is intended here, viz. He is most strong. He's called El Shaddai, God Almighty, Genesis 17 verse 1. His almightiness lies in this: he can do whatever is feasible. Divines distinguish between authority and power. God hath both. First, he hath a sovereign right and authority over man. He can do with his creatures as he pleases. Who shall dispute with God? Who shall ask him a reason of his doings? Daniel 4 verse 35. He doeth according to his will in the army of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth, and none can stay his hand or say unto him, What doest thou? God sits judge in the highest court. He calls the monarchs of the earth to the bar, and is not bound to give a reason of his proceedings. Psalm 75 verses 5 and 7. He putteth down one and setteth up another. He hath salvation and damnation in his power. He hath the key of justice in his hand, to lock up whom he will in the fiery prison of hell, and he hath the key of mercy in his hands, to open heaven's gate to whom he pleases. This is the name engraven upon his vesture, King of kings and Lord of lords, Revelation 19 verse 16. He sits Lord paramount, and who can call him to an account? Isaiah 46 verse 10, I will do all my pleasure. The world is God's diocese, and shall not he do what he will in his own diocese? He it was that turned King Nebuchadnezzar to eat grass, and threw the angels to hell when they sinned, that broke the head of the Babylonish empire. Isaiah 14 verse 11. How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer? Thy pomp is brought down to the grave. Who sets bounds to the sea and bridles the proud waves. Job 38 verse 11. God is the supreme monarch. All power is seated originally in him. The powers that be are ordained of God. Romans 13 verse 1. Kings hold their crowns of him. Proverbs 8 verse 15, By me kings reign. Second, as God hath authority, so he hath infinite power. What is authority without power? He is mighty in strength. Job 9 verse 4. This power of God is seen, 1, in the creation. To create requires infinite power. All the world cannot make a fly. God's power in creating is evident, 1, because he needs no instruments to work with. It is proper to God to work without tools. 2, he needs no matter to work upon. First he creates matter, and then works upon it. 3, he works without labor. Psalm 33 verse 9, he spake and it was done. 2, the power of God is seen in the conversion of souls. Surely a mighty power went to raise Christ from the grave. Ephesians 1 verse 20. 1, the same power goes to draw a sinner to God as drew Christ out of the grave to heaven. Greater power is put forth in conversion than in creation. When God made the world, he met with no opposition, as he had nothing to help him, so he had nothing to hinder him. But when he comes to convert a sinner, here he meets with opposition. Satan opposeth him, and the heart opposeth him. A sinner is angry with converting grace. 2, the world was the work of God's fingers. Psalm 8 verse 3. Conversion is the work of God's arm. Luke 1 verse 5. 3, in the creation God wrought but one miracle. He spake the word. But in conversion he works many miracles. The blind is made to see, the dead is raised, the deaf hears the voice of the Son of God. Oh, the infinite power of Jehovah! Before his scepter angels veil and prostrate themselves. Kings cast their crowns at his feet. Amos 9 verse 5. He toucheth the land, and it shall melt. Job 9 verse 6. Which shaketh the earth out of her place. An earthquake makes the earth tremble upon her pillars, but God shakes it out of its place. He can remove the earth from its center. God can do what he will. His power is as large as his will. Were men's power as large as their will, what work would they make in the world? God's power is of equal extent with his will. God can with a word unpin the wheels and break the axle tree of the creation. He can do more than we can think. Ephesians 3 verse 20. He can suspend natural agents. He sealed up the lions' mouths, made the fire not to burn. He made the waters to stand upon an heap. He caused the sun to go 10 degrees backwards in Ahaz his dial. Isaiah 38 verse 8. What can pose omnipotency? The Lord cuts off the spirit of princes. Psalm 76 verse 12, he counterworks his enemies, he pulls down their flags and banners of pride, infatuates their counsels, breaks their forces, and he doth it with ease, with the turning of his hand. Psalm 81 verse 24, with his breath. Isaiah 40 verse 24, with a look. That is all it needs cost God to destroy his enemies, a look, a cast of his eye. Exodus 14 verse 24, the Lord looked into the host of the Egyptians through the pillar of fire and troubled their host. Who shall stop him in his march? God commands, and all creatures in heaven and earth obey him. Xerxes, the Persian monarch, threw fetters into the sea when its waves swelled, as if he would have chained up the waters. But when God speaks, the wind and sea obey him. If he say but the word, the stars fight in their course against Sisera. If he stamp with his foot, an army of angels shall presently be in battalia. What cannot omnipotent power do? The Lord is a man of war. Exodus 15 verse 3. He hath a mighty arm. Psalm 89 verse 13. God's power is a glorious power. Colossians 1 verse 11. First, it is an irresistible power. Romans 9 verse 19. Who hath resisted his will? To contest with him is as if the thorns should set themselves in battle array against the fire, or as if an infirm child should fight with an archangel. If the sinner be once taken in God's iron net, there is no escaping. Isaiah 43 verse 13, there is none that can deliver out of my hand. Second, God's power is an inexhaustible power. It is never spent or wasted. Men, while they exercise their strength, weaken it, but God hath an everlasting spring of strength in him. Isaiah 26 verse 4. Though he spends his arrows upon his enemies, Deuteronomy 32 verse 23, yet he doth not spend his strength. Isaiah 40 verse 28, he fainteth not, neither is weary. Objection. Can God do all things? He cannot deny himself. Answer. Though God can do all things, he cannot do that which stains the glory of his Godhead. He cannot sin, he cannot do that which implies a contradiction. To be a God of truth and yet deny himself is a contradiction. Use first. If God be so infinite in power, fear this great God. We are apt to fear such as are in power. Jeremiah 5 verse 22, Fear ye not me, saith the Lord. Will ye not tremble at my presence? He hath power to cast our souls and bodies into hell. Psalm 90 verse 11, Who knows the power of his wrath? God can, with the same breath that made us, dissolve us. His eyes are as a flame of fire. The rocks are thrown down by him. Nahum 1 verse 6, Solomon saith, Where the word of a king is, there is power. Ecclesiastes 8 verse 4, Much more where the word of a God is. Oh, let us fear this mighty God. The fear of God will drive out all other base fear. Use second. See the deplorable condition of wicked men. 1. This power of God is not for them. 2. It is against them. 1. This power of God is not for them. They have no union with God, therefore have no warrant to lay claim to his power. His power is no relief to them. He hath power to forgive sins, but he will not put forth his power towards an impenitent sinner. God's power is an eagle's wing to carry the saints to heaven, but what privilege is that to the wicked? Though a man will carry his child in his arms over a dangerous water, yet he will not carry an enemy in his arms. God's power is not engaged to help those that fight against him. Let miseries come upon the wicked, they have none to help them. They are like a ship in a storm without a pilot, driven upon the rocks. 2. This power of God is against the wicked. God's power will not be the sinner's shield to defend him, but a sword to wound him. God's power will bind the sinner in chains. God's power serves to revenge the wrong done to his mercy. God will be almighty to damn the sinner. Now, in what condition is every unbeliever? God's power is engaged against him, and it is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. Hebrews 10 verse 31. Use third. It reproves such as do not believe this power of God. We say we do not doubt of God's power, but his will. But indeed it is God's power that we question. Is there anything too hard for me? Jeremiah 32 verse 27, Yet we stagger through unbelief, as if the arm of God's power were shrunk, and he could not help in desperate cases. Take away a king's power, and we unking him. Take away the Lord's power, and we unguard him. Yet how guilty of this are we? Did not Israel question God's power? Can God furnish a table in the wilderness? Psalm 78 verse 19. They thought the wilderness was a fitter place for making of graves than spreading of a table. Did not Martha doubt of Christ's power? John 11 verse 39, He hath been dead 4 days. If Christ had been there while Lazarus was sick, or when he had been newly dead, Martha did not question but Christ could have raised him. But he had lain in the grave 4 days, and now she seemed to question his power. Christ had as much ado to raise her faith as to raise her dead brother. And Moses, though an holy man, yet limits God's power through unbelief. Numbers 11 verse 21, the people among whom I am are 600,000 footmen, and thou hast said, I will give them flesh, that they may eat a whole month. Shall the flocks and the herds be slain for them to suffice them? Or shall all the fish of the sea be gathered for them to suffice them? And the Lord said unto Moses, Is the Lord's hand waxed short? This is a great affront to God, to go to deny his power. That men doubt of God's power appears, one, by their taking indirect courses. Would they defraud in their dealings, use false weights if they believed the power of God, that they could provide for them? 2, by their depending more upon second causes than upon God. 2 Chronicles 16 verse 12, in his disease he sought not the Lord, but to the physicians. Use 4th, if God be infinite in power, then let us take heed of hardening our hearts against God. Job 9 verse 4, who hath hardened himself against him and prospered. Job sends a challenge to all creatures in heaven and earth. Who is he did ever take up the buckler against God and came off conqueror? For a person to go on daringly in any sin is to harden his heart against God, and, as it were, to raise a war against heaven, and let him remember God is El Shaddai, Almighty. He will be too hard for them that oppose him. Job 40 verse 9, Hast thou an arm like God? Such as will not bow to his golden scepter shall be broken with his iron rod. Julian hardened his heart against God, he opposed him to his face, but what got he at last? Did he prosper? Being wounded in battle, he threw up his blood into the air, and said to Christ, Vis ist thee, Galileo, O Galilean, thou hast overcome. I acknowledge thy power, whose name and truth I have opposed. Will folly contend with wisdom, weakness with power, finite with infinite? O take heed of hardening your heart against God. He can send legions of angels to avenge his quarrel. It is better to meet God with tears in your eyes than weapons in your hand. You may overcome God sooner by repentance than by resistance. Use 5th. Get an interest in God, and then this glorious power is engaged for you. God gives it under his hand, that he will put forth the whole power of his Godhead for the good of his people. 1 Chronicles 17 verse 24. The Lord of hosts is the God of Israel, even a God to Israel. This almightiness of God's power is a wonderful support and comfort to every believer. It was Samson's riddle, Judges 14 verse 14, out of the strong came forth sweetness. So out of the attribute of God's power, out of this strong comes forth sweetness. It is comfort in several cases. 1, in case of strong corruption. My sins, saith a child of God, are potent. I have no power against this army that comes against me. I pray and humble my soul by fasting, but my sins return upon me. Aye, but dost thou believe the power of God? The strong God can conquer thy strong corruption. Though sin be too hard for thee, yet not for him. He can soften hard hearts and quicken the dead. Is anything too hard for the Lord? Genesis 18 verse 14. Set God's power on work by faith and prayer. Say, Lord, it is not for thy honour that the devil should have so strong a party within me. O break the head of this Leviathan. Abba, Father, all things are possible to thee. 2, in case of strong temptation. Satan is called the strong man. Oh, but remember the power of God. Christ is called the Lion of the tribe of Judah. He hath broken the serpent's head upon the cross. Satan is a chained enemy and a conquered enemy. Michael is stronger than the dragon. 3, comfort in case of weakness of grace and fear of falling away. I pray, but I cannot send out strong cries. I believe, but the hand of my faith doth shake and tremble. Cannot God strengthen weak grace? 2 Corinthians 12 verse 9. My strength is made perfect in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, will I rather glory in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. I fear I shall not hold out. Christian, dost thou believe the power of God? Hast not God preserved thy grace thus far? Mayest thou not set up thy Ebenezer? God hath kept thy grace hitherto as a spark in the main ocean, and is not he able still to keep thy grace? 1 Peter 1 verse 5. Who are kept by the power of God, etc. God's mercy pardons us, but his power preserves us. He who by his power keeps the stars, that they do not fall out of their orbs, keeps our grace, that it doth not fail or annihilate. 4. Comfort in case of the deficiency in thy estate. God can multiply the oil in the cruse. Miraculously he can raise up supplies. God, who provides for the birds of the air, cannot he provide for his children? He that clothes the lilies, cannot he clothe his lambs? 5. Comfort in regard to the resurrection. This seems difficult to believe, that the bodies of men, when eaten up by worms, devoured by beasts and fishes, or consumed to ashes, should be raised the same numerical bodies. But if we believe the power of God, it is no great wonder. Which is hardest, to create or raise the dead? He that can make a body of nothing can restore it to its parts when mingled and confounded with other substances. Matthew 19, verse 26. With God all things are possible. If we believe the first article of the Creed, that God is almighty, we may quickly believe the other article, the resurrection of the body. God can raise the dead because of his power, and he cannot but raise them because of his truth. 6. It is comfort in reference to the Church of God. He can save and deliver it when it is brought low. The enemies have power in their hand, but the remainder of wrath God will restrain. Psalm 76, verse 10. God can either confine the enemy's power or confound it. If God be for us, who can be against us? God can create Jerusalem a praise. Isaiah 45, verse 18. The church in Ezekiel is compared to dry bones, but God made breath to enter into them, and they lived. Ezekiel 37, verse 10. The ship of the church may be tossed because sin is in it, but it shall not be overwhelmed because Christ is in it. Psalm 46, verse 6. Deus in medio. All the church's pangs shall help forward her deliverance.